After 5 years overseas, I returned to my childhood home to find my uncle living there. "Your mother sold it to me before she died," he said. He didn't know about her safe, deed, and recording hidden. I stood on the front porch of the house I'd grown up in, the blue 2-story colonial on Maple Street that had been in our family for 3 generations, and watched through the window as my Uncle Donovan poured himself coffee in my mother's kitchen. He was wearing slippers, reading the newspaper at the breakfast table like he owned the place, completely at home in a space that should have been mine. It was 10:30 on a Saturday morning in November, exactly 5 years and 3 months since I'd left for an engineering contract in Dubai, and 3 months since I'd gotten the call that my mother had died from a sudden heart attack at 62. I'd flown back for the funeral, stayed 4 days handling immediate arrangements, then had returned to Dubai to finish my contract before coming home permanently. The plan had been to sell the house, settle the estate, maybe keep some of Mom's things, and start fresh somewhere new. Instead, I was looking at my uncle drinking coffee in what he was claiming was his house. My key didn't work in the front door. The locks had been changed. I'd knocked, heard Donovan's heavy footsteps approaching, and when he'd opened the door, his face had cycled through surprise, annoyance, and then this false warmth that had made my stomach clench. He'd said my name like a question, like he hadn't been expecting me, even though I'd told multiple family members I'd be returning this week to deal with the estate. He'd let me in, awkward and proprietary at the same time, and I'd asked him directly what he was doing here, why he had a key, why the locks were changed. That's when he'd told me. "Your mother sold the house to me 6 months before she died. I have the deed and everything. She wanted me to have it." I'd stared at him, trying to process words that made no sense. Mom would never have sold this house, especially not to Donovan, her younger brother who she'd bailed out financially a dozen times over the years, but had never fully trusted. I'd asked to see the deed. He'd produced it from a folder in the study, my mother's study, pointing to signatures and dates and a notary seal. Everything had looked official, and my hands had started shaking. I'd known Donovan my entire life, my mother's brother by 5 years, a man who'd always been on the periphery of our family with grand schemes and poor execution. He'd worked in sales, real estate, various ventures that had promised big returns and delivered bankruptcies. My mother had loaned him money countless times, co-signed loans she'd ended up paying, let him stay in our guest room during his 2 divorces. She'd loved him because he was family, but had been clear-eyed about his character, had told me once that Donovan was the kind of person who'd take advantage of anyone if he thought he could get away with it. She'd said it with sadness, not judgment, like it was a fact she'd accepted about her brother. When I'd left for Dubai 5 years ago, Donovan had been going through his second divorce, broke and bitter, asking Mom for another loan she'd gently refused. She'd told me she was done enabling him, that he needed to figure out his own life without her money as a safety net. That had been our last real conversation about him. Over the 5 years I'd been overseas, I'd talked to Mom every week via video calls, sometimes twice a week depending on our schedules. She'd never mentioned selling the house, never hinted at plans to move or downsize. She'd talked about the garden she was planting, the book club she'd joined, the volunteer work at the animal shelter. She'd sent me photos of the house looking exactly as it always had, the same furniture, the same decorations, the same sense of permanence. 3 months ago, when she'd died suddenly, the funeral had been at our family church, the reception at this house, and I'd walked through rooms that had felt frozen in time. Donovan had been there, appropriately grieving, talking about what a wonderful sister she'd been. He'd hugged me, said we'd need to talk about estate matters when I was back permanently, that there were things to sort through. Nothing in his manner had suggested he owned the house. Nothing had prepared me for coming back to find him living here. I'd asked Donovan when the sale had happened. He'd said 8 months ago, showed me the deed dated February 19th of that year. I'd asked why Mom would sell him the house. He'd said she'd known she was sick, had wanted to ensure the house stayed in the family, had offered him a below-market price in exchange for taking care of estate details and letting her live here until she died. The story had sounded plausible on the surface, but had felt wrong in every instinct I'd possessed. Mom hadn't been sick. She'd died of a sudden heart attack with no warning. Her last checkup had been clean according to the paperwork I'd received, and she'd had a will. I'd seen it at the lawyer's office during the funeral, a simple document leaving everything to me as her only child. The house had been mentioned specifically as part of my inheritance. I'd pointed this out to Donovan. He'd said that will was old, written before she'd sold him the house, that the sale superseded the will's property distribution. He'd said it almost smugly, like he'd checked with lawyers and knew exactly what he was talking about. I'd left the house with a copy of the deed Donovan had provided, my mind racing through possibilities I didn't want to consider. Either my mother had sold the house to Donovan without telling me and lied about it during our weekly calls for 8 months, or Donovan had forged the sale somehow and was stealing my inheritance. The first option seemed impossible. Mom and I had been close, talked about everything, and she'd specifically mentioned in our calls that she'd wanted me to have the house when she died, that it was paid off and would give me a financial foundation when I came back to the States. The second option seemed equally impossible because the deed looked legitimate, had an official notary seal, seemed to be properly filed with the county. I'd driven to a coffee shop, sat with my laptop, and started researching property fraud, forged deeds, and elder exploitation. The information I'd found had been disturbing and educational in equal measure. According to what I'd read, deed fraud was more common than most people realized, particularly targeting elderly homeowners or those with family members facing financial desperation. The process typically involved forging signatures on quitclaim deeds or purchase agreements, finding corrupt notaries or faking notary seals, and filing the fraudulent documents with county recorders who processed thousands of deeds monthly and rarely verified authenticity. Once filed, the fraudulent deed became part of public record, creating a legal presumption of ownership that was difficult to challenge without clear evidence of forgery. Victims often didn't discover the theft until they tried to sell, refinance, or when the new owner tried to evict them. The websites I'd read had listed red flags: sudden sales at below-market prices, sales to family members with financial problems, owners who claimed not to remember signing documents, sales shortly before the original owner's death. Every red flag had applied to Donovan's claimed purchase. I'd contacted the estate attorney who'd handled Mom's will reading, a woman named Carolyn Fletcher, who'd been practicing for 28 years. I'd explained the situation, sent her a copy of the deed Donovan had provided. She'd called me back within 2 hours, her voice tight with concern. She'd said that deed, if legitimate, would indeed supersede the will's property distribution, that a person could sell their property any time before death, regardless of what their will said. But she'd also said something about the deed bothered her. The sale price was listed as $75,000 for a house worth at minimum $350,000, based on recent comparable sales in the neighborhood. Sales that far below market value to family members often indicated fraud or undue influence, particularly if the original owner was elderly or compromised. Carolyn had asked if I knew whether Mom had actually received $75,000. I'd said I didn't know, that I'd need to check her bank records. Carolyn had said that should be my next step, that following the money would tell us whether this sale was real or fabricated. I'd gone to Mom's bank the next day, the regional branch where she'd done business for 30 years. I'd brought her death certificate, proof of my identity as her son, and the estate documents naming me as executor. The bank manager, a man named Gordon Ellis, who'd actually known my mother personally, had helped me access her accounts. We'd pulled transaction records for the entire year before her death, looking for any deposit around $75,000 near the deed date of February 19th. There was nothing. No large deposits, no wire transfers, no cashier's checks or unusual transactions. Her account showed the same pattern it had maintained for years: Social Security deposits, pension from her career as a nurse, regular withdrawals for living expenses, and nothing that suggested a house sale. Gordon had looked troubled, said that if she'd sold her house, she should have deposited the payment somewhere, that $75,000 didn't just disappear. He'd suggested I check if she'd had other accounts I didn't know about. I'd said I'd check, but knew Mom had been organized and straightforward about finances. She'd had one checking account, one savings account, and a small investment account managed by her financial advisor. All of them had been listed in her estate documents. None showed evidence of a house sale. I'd driven back to the house that afternoon, asked Donovan to show me proof of payment. He'd produced a copy of a cashier's check dated February 19th, made out to my mother for $75,000, drawn on First National Bank. I'd taken photos of the check copy, then had driven to First National and asked if they could verify the check's authenticity. The teller had looked it up, confirmed a check with that number, and amount had been issued on that date to the payee listed. I'd asked who had purchased the check. She'd said privacy regulations prevented her from disclosing that without a subpoena, but the check had been issued and had been cashed. I'd asked where it had been cashed. She'd said their system showed it had been deposited at a different branch, but she couldn't provide more details. The check was real. It had been cashed. But Mom's bank accounts didn't show the deposit. The discrepancy had made my head hurt trying to reconcile it. I'd called Carolyn Fletcher, explained about the check and the missing deposit. She'd been quiet for a moment, then had said there were two possibilities. Either Mom had cashed the check and kept the money somewhere I hadn't found yet, or someone had forged her signature and deposited the check into a different account. Both scenarios raised questions. If Mom had sold the house and hidden the money, why? If someone had forged her signature and stolen the payment, who and how? Carolyn had said we needed to verify the signatures on the deed and the check deposit, that we should request the original documents from the county recorder and the bank to have them examined by a forensic document examiner. She'd said this was getting complicated enough that we should consider hiring a private investigator to piece together the timeline and find what was missing. She'd recommended someone she'd worked with before, a former detective named Russell Oakes, who specialized in financial fraud and estate disputes. Russell Oakes had agreed to meet me the next day at a diner near downtown. He was maybe 55, gray hair, methodical manner, the kind of investigator who looked like he'd spent decades dealing with liars and thieves. I'd explained everything: the 5 years overseas, Mom's death, finding Donovan in the house, the deed that seemed legitimate, the payment that couldn't be traced to Mom's accounts. Russell had taken notes, asked specific questions about timing and relationships, wanted to know everything about Donovan's history and financial situation. I told him about the failed businesses, the bankruptcies, the divorces, Mom's pattern of bailing him out financially. Russell had nodded like this was a familiar story. He'd said cases like this usually involved family members who knew the victim's routines and vulnerabilities, who had access to personal information, and who were desperate enough to rationalize theft as somehow deserved. He'd quoted me $5,000 for 2 weeks of investigation, said he'd trace the check, examine the deed, interview anyone relevant, and build a timeline of what had actually happened. The investigation had started with the check. Russell had obtained bank records through legal channels I didn't fully understand, but that apparently involved subpoenas and financial fraud statutes. He'd discovered that the $75,000 cashier's check had been deposited into an account at First National Bank, but not my mother's account. The account belonged to Donovan. He'd opened it specifically to receive the check, deposited it 3 days after the check was issued, then had transferred the money out to various accounts and debts over the following month. Russell had shown me the transaction records, the clear paper trail of Donovan creating an account, depositing the check, and then draining the account. I'd asked how Donovan could deposit a check made out to my mother into his own account. Russell had said that was the key question, that it should have required Mom's endorsement, and we'd needed to see the actual deposited check to examine the signature. The bank had provided a copy of the deposited check, front and back, showing my mother's signature endorsing it over to Donovan. Russell had taken the signature to a forensic document examiner, a woman named Dr. Patricia Langford, who'd testified in hundreds of fraud cases over 23 years. She'd compared the signature on the check to known samples of my mother's signature from her will, her medical records, her bank documents. After 3 days of analysis, Dr. Langford had provided a written report concluding the signature on the check was a forgery. The formation of specific letters was inconsistent with my mother's natural writing patterns. The pressure and flow were wrong, and microscopic examination showed evidence of tracing or simulation rather than authentic signature production. The check had been signed by someone imitating my mother's signature, not by my mother herself. Russell had then examined the deed, requesting the original from the county recorder's office and having Dr. Langford analyze my mother's signature on that document as well. Same conclusion. The signature was forged, showing the same inconsistencies and simulation evidence as the check signature. My mother had never signed the deed transferring her house to Donovan. Someone had forged her signature, created fraudulent transfer documents, and filed them with the county to make the theft look legitimate. The notary seal on the deed was also suspicious. Russell had tracked down the notary whose seal appeared on the document, a woman named Linda Graves, who worked at a tax preparation service. Linda had been cooperative, had checked her records, and had no documentation of notarizing any deed from my mother on February 19th or any other date. She'd said her notary stamp had been stolen from her office about 10 months ago, reported to police but never recovered. Someone had used her stolen stamp to create a fraudulent notarization. I'd sat in Russell's office looking at the evidence laid out systematically. The forged signatures, the fraudulent deed, the stolen notary seal, the check deposited into Donovan's account, the paper trail showing theft disguised as a legitimate sale. My uncle had stolen my mother's house through systematic fraud, had forged her signature on legal documents, had stolen a notary seal to create false authentication, and had filed everything with the county to establish a false ownership claim. The scope of it was staggering. This wasn't opportunistic theft. This was premeditated fraud executed over months while my mother was alive and after she died. Russell had said we had 2 options: confront Donovan and demand he return the property, or go to the police with the evidence and pursue criminal charges. He'd recommended the police route, that fraud, this deliberate, deserved prosecution, that Donovan would likely face multiple felony charges. I'd wanted to confront Donovan first, to hear him try to explain this, to watch him lie while I knew the truth. Russell had advised against it, said it would tip Donovan off and give him time to flee or destroy additional evidence. But I'd needed to see his face when he realized I knew. I'd called him, asked to meet at the house to discuss some financial details. He'd agreed, sounding cautious but not panicked. I'd brought Russell with me, told Donovan we'd needed to clarify some things about the sale. Donovan had sat in the living room, my mother's living room that he'd stolen, and had asked what we'd needed to clarify. I'd asked him to walk me through the purchase, how it had been negotiated, when Mom had signed the papers. He'd told a smooth story about Mom approaching him months before her death, saying she'd wanted the house to stay in the family, offering him the below-market price in exchange for taking care of her affairs. Every word had been a lie delivered with practiced sincerity. I'd asked if he remembered the day Mom signed the deed. He'd said, of course, it had been February 19th. They'd met at her house, she'd signed the papers, he'd taken them to be notarized by Linda Graves. I'd pointed out that Linda Graves had no record of notarizing the deed and had reported her stamp stolen months before the supposed notarization. Donovan's face had changed, color draining, eyes going wide, like he'd been caught in something he'd thought was airtight. He'd started to say Linda must be mistaken, that maybe she'd forgotten the appointment. I'd cut him off, told him we'd had the signatures examined by a forensic expert who'd concluded they were forgeries. Donovan had stood up, said this was ridiculous, that he'd had a legitimate transaction and we were trying to create problems. I'd asked him why the $75,000 check had been deposited into his account instead of Mom's if the transaction had been legitimate. He'd gone silent, trapped by details he couldn't explain away. Russell had told Donovan we were taking the evidence to the police, that he should hire a lawyer, that criminal charges were imminent. Donovan had tried to argue, said I was being ungrateful, that Mom had wanted him to have the house, and I was dishonoring her wishes. I told him Mom's wishes were documented in her will, leaving everything to me, that the deed he'd created was fraud, and that he'd stolen my inheritance using forged documents. He'd called me names, said I'd been overseas living my life while he'd taken care of Mom, that I didn't deserve the house. I'd pointed out that the bank records showed Mom had been taking care of herself fine, that Donovan had barely been in contact with her according to her phone logs that Russell had obtained. The lies had been piling up, Donovan's story falling apart under basic scrutiny. He'd ordered us out of the house. I'd told him it wasn't his house to order anyone out of, that the deed was fraudulent and would be voided. We'd left him sitting there, trapped in a theft that was unraveling. I'd filed a police report the next morning, brought all of Russell's evidence, and met with a detective named Lawrence Kent who specialized in financial crimes. Detective Kent had been with the department for 19 years, had handled dozens of deed fraud cases, and had been grimly unsurprised by what I'd presented. He'd said this was a clear case, the evidence was solid, and he would open a criminal investigation immediately. He'd asked if I'd wanted to press charges, or if I'd preferred to resolve this civilly. I'd told him I'd wanted charges pressed, that Donovan had committed systematic fraud and deserved prosecution. Detective Kent had said he'd bring Donovan in for questioning, that based on the evidence I'd provided, they'd likely be charging him with multiple counts. Forgery, theft by deception, filing fraudulent documents, possibly elder abuse if they could prove he'd manipulated Mom before her death. Each charge carried potential prison time. This wasn't a slap on the wrist. This was serious felony prosecution. The interrogation had happened 3 days later. Detective Kent had brought Donovan in, confronted him with the forensic evidence, the bank records, the timeline showing systematic fraud. Russell had been allowed to observe through the glass, and he'd told me later that Donovan had tried to maintain his story for about 20 minutes before cracking. When confronted with the forged signatures, he'd claimed Mom had been too sick to sign herself and had asked him to sign for her. When asked why he'd used a stolen notary seal, he'd said he hadn't known it was stolen. When asked why the payment had gone into his account, he'd fumbled for explanations that didn't make sense. Eventually, he'd asked for a lawyer, ending the interrogation, but the damage was done. His lies were documented. His story was contradicted by evidence. The case was solid. Donovan had been charged 2 weeks later. 3 counts of forgery, 1 count of theft over $50,000, 1 count of filing fraudulent documents, and 1 count of exploiting a vulnerable adult, given that Mom had been 62 and the fraud had been committed shortly before her death. The charges had carried a combined potential sentence of 15 to 20 years. The district attorney handling the case, a woman named Sharon Yee with 12 years prosecuting white-collar crime, had been confident about conviction. She'd told me the forensic evidence was airtight, that juries understood fraud even when it was complex, and that Donovan's lies to police would be admissible and damaging. She'd said most defendants in cases this strong took plea deals to avoid trial, that I should expect Donovan's lawyer to negotiate for reduced charges in exchange for guilty plea and restitution. The plea negotiations had taken 3 months. Donovan's attorney, a public defender named Albert Wu who'd been doing this for 8 years, had tried to argue his client had genuinely believed the transaction was legitimate, that there had been a misunderstanding rather than criminal intent. Sharon had countered with the evidence, the forged signatures, the stolen notary seal, the lies to police, the money deposited into Donovan's own account. There was no misunderstanding. There was premeditated theft. Albert had eventually negotiated a plea agreement. Donovan would plead guilty to felony theft and fraudulent filing. The other charges would be dropped. He'd receive 8 years in state prison with possibility of parole after 5, and he'd be ordered to pay full restitution including the house's current market value, all legal fees, and investigative costs. Total restitution, approximately $420,000. Donovan had taken the plea, faced with overwhelming evidence and the prospect of 20 years if convicted at trial. The sentencing hearing had been brief. Donovan had stood before the judge, a man named Honorable David Summers with 32 years on the bench, and had made a short statement about being sorry, about making bad decisions, about not meaning to hurt anyone. The apology had felt hollow, more about reducing his sentence than actual remorse. Judge Summers had been unimpressed. He'd noted the systematic nature of the fraud, the betrayal of family trust, the targeting of an elderly sister who'd helped Donovan repeatedly over the years. He'd said the 8-year sentence was appropriate given the severity and premeditation, and that he'd hoped it would send a message about deed fraud and elder exploitation. Donovan had been remanded to custody immediately, beginning his sentence that day. I'd watched him be led out in handcuffs. This uncle I'd known my whole life, now convicted felon facing years in prison for stealing my mother's house. The legal process to void the fraudulent deed and restore my ownership had taken another 2 months. Carolyn Fletcher had filed motions with the county, provided the criminal conviction and forensic evidence, and requested the court declare the deed null and void. The county had cooperated once the criminal case was resolved, removing the fraudulent deed from record and restoring the property to my mother's estate, which meant to me as sole heir. The house had been legally mine again, the theft reversed through documentation and prosecution. I'd had the locks changed again, this time with me as the rightful owner, and had walked through rooms that Donovan had occupied for months. He'd made minimal changes, which had been something, hadn't destroyed or sold anything irreplaceable. But the violation of having him live here, sleep in my mother's room, use her things while claiming he'd owned them, had been disturbing in ways I'd still been processing. While sorting through Mom's belongings, preparing to eventually sell the house and move forward, I'd found something in her bedroom closet that had changed my understanding of everything. Behind a false panel I'd never known existed, built into the back wall of the closet, there'd been a small safe. I'd had discovered it only because I'd been removing shelving and had noticed the panel was hollow when I'd knocked on it. The safe had been a basic digital model, requiring a code I hadn't known. I'd tried obvious combinations: Mom's birthday, my birthday, her anniversary with Dad who died when I was 12. None had worked. Then I'd tried the date Dad had died, and the safe had opened. Inside had been documents and a recording that had explained everything. The deed to the house, the original deed in Mom's name, stamped and recorded properly. A will dated 1 month before she'd died, handwritten and signed, stating clearly that she'd left everything to me and that under no circumstances was Donovan to receive any part of her estate. A notarized letter explaining that Donovan had approached her 8 months before her death asking to buy the house, that she'd had refused, and that he'd had become angry and threatening. She'd documented dates and details of his pressure, his claims that he'd deserved the house because he'd was family and I'd was overseas living well while he'd struggled. She'd written that she'd suspected Donovan might try to steal the property somehow, that he'd asked too many questions about her finances and estate planning, and that she'd was creating this record to protect her wishes in case something happened to her. Most devastating had been the audio recording, a conversation between Mom and Donovan recorded on her phone about 6 months before she'd died. In it, Donovan had been trying to convince her to sell him the house, offering $50,000, saying she didn't need such a big place. Mom had refused firmly, told him the house was staying in the family by going to me, that she'd had already decided. Donovan had gotten angry, his voice rising, saying I didn't deserve anything, that I'd abandoned her to work overseas while he'd been here. Mom had told him I'd been building my career, and we'd talked weekly, that there had been no abandonment. Donovan had said something chilling then. He'd said if she wouldn't sell him the house fairly, maybe he'd find another way. Mom had told him to leave. The recording had ended there. She'd had known. She'd had known Donovan was planning something, and she'd had tried to protect against it by creating this hidden evidence. I'd brought the safe contents to Carolyn Fletcher immediately. She'd reviewed everything, especially the dated will and the letter about Donovan's threats. She'd said this was powerful evidence that could have prevented the entire fraud if it had been found sooner, that Mom had been smart to document everything but tragic that she'd had died before ensuring someone knew about the safe. The recording of Donovan's threat had been particularly valuable, proving premeditation and intent. Carolyn had said we should provide this to the district attorney, that it could be used to challenge any future parole hearings, to demonstrate that Donovan's crime had been planned and threatened rather than impulsive. She'd also said the handwritten will, while legally superseded by the earlier formal will, reinforced Mom's clear intentions about the estate. I'd met with Sharon Yee again, showed her the safe contents and the recording. She'd listened to Donovan's voice on the tape, his threat about finding another way to get the house, and had shook her head with recognition. She'd said this explained everything, that Donovan had essentially announced his intention to defraud Mom and then had executed that plan after her death when he'd thought there'd be no one around who'd knew enough to challenge him. My being overseas for 5 years had been his opportunity. He'd had thought he could steal the house, claim a legitimate sale, and I'd be too far away or too uninformed to stop him. The plan had almost worked. If I hadn't been persistent, if I hadn't hired Russell, if I hadn't found the forensic evidence, Donovan would have gotten away with it. Sharon had asked if I'd wanted the recording and threats considered for the sentencing, but the plea deal had already been finalized and Donovan was in prison. What she could do was ensure the evidence was part of his file for parole hearings, making it harder for him to claim his crime had been a one-time mistake or misunderstanding. She'd also suggested I'd write a victim impact statement for the parole board, detailing how the fraud had affected me, how it had violated my mother's clearly stated wishes, and how Donovan's actions had betrayed family trust. I'd agreed to write it, wanting to ensure that when Donovan eventually faced parole review, the board would understand the full scope of what he'd had done. The house had eventually sold for $395,000, slightly above market due to the neighborhood's desirability and the property's good condition. Donovan's restitution order had meant he'd owed me $420,000, but realistically, he'd never be able to pay it from prison wages. The court had placed liens on any future assets he might acquire, but Sharon had been honest that most restitution orders went unpaid. What mattered more than the money was that justice had been served, that Donovan was in prison for his fraud, and that Mom's wishes had ultimately been honored despite his theft. I'd used the proceeds from the house sale to pay off my student loans, invest in retirement accounts, and put a down payment on a condo in the city where I'd taken a new engineering position. The inheritance, once nearly stolen, had provided exactly the financial foundation Mom had wanted me to have. I'd kept some of her belongings, her jewelry, photo albums, some furniture that had sentimental value. The rest had been donated or sold. Clearing out the house had been emotional, every room holding memories of growing up, of family dinners, of Mom's presence. But it had also been tainted by knowing Donovan had lived here, had slept in these rooms, had claimed ownership of memories that weren't his to claim. 2 years after Donovan's conviction, I'd received notice of his first parole hearing. He'd been denied, the board citing the severity of the fraud, the betrayal of family trust, and the victim impact statement I'd submitted. They'd told him to serve more of his sentence and demonstrate genuine remorse before reapplying. He'd have another hearing in 3 years. I'd planned to submit another statement opposing parole to ensure the board never forgot what he'd done and why he'd deserved the full sentence. I'd thought often about that safe hidden in Mom's closet, the evidence she'd carefully preserved, the recording of Donovan's threat that had proven premeditation. She'd known. She'd known her brother was dangerous and dishonest. She'd tried to protect me even from beyond death. The fact that Donovan hadn't known about the safe, hadn't thought to search for hidden evidence, had been his downfall. He'd assumed Mom was naive and unprepared. He'd been wrong. She'd been smart and careful, documenting his threats and preserving the truth for whenever it would be needed. That truth, hidden but waiting, had destroyed his theft as completely as the forged deed had temporarily enabled it. The experience had taught me things about family I'd wished I hadn't needed to learn. That blood relationships didn't guarantee loyalty or integrity. That desperation could turn people into criminals. That trust, once betrayed, couldn't be rebuilt regardless of shared history. Donovan and I would never have a relationship again. He'd stolen from his own sister, had planned to steal from her son, and had only been stopped by evidence and prosecution. Those weren't mistakes or misunderstandings. Those were choices that revealed character. He'd shown me exactly who he was, and I'd believed him. I'd stayed in touch with Russell Oakes, the investigator who'd built the case that had exposed Donovan's fraud. Russell had told me he'd used this case as an example when consulting with other families facing similar elder exploitation situations. The combination of forensic document examination, financial tracing, and systematic timeline construction had been textbook fraud investigation. He'd said too many families gave up when facing fraudulent deeds, believing the documents were too official to challenge or the process too expensive to fight. My case had proven that with proper investigation and legal support, deed fraud could be exposed and reversed. He'd hoped other families would be encouraged by the outcome. Carolyn Fletcher had told me something similar, that she'd started advising her estate planning clients to create hidden evidence caches like Mom had, places to store authentic documents and recordings in case someone tried to forge or destroy official records. She'd said the legal system worked when there was evidence, but that victims needed to create and protect that evidence proactively. Mom had done exactly that. She'd anticipated the threat, documented it, and preserved the truth. The safe Donovan hadn't known about had contained his conviction. 3 years after the conviction, I'd run into one of Donovan's ex-wives at a coffee shop. She'd recognized me, approached cautiously, asked if I'd heard about his imprisonment. I'd said yes, that I'd been the one who'd pressed charges. She'd nodded, unsurprised, and had told me she wasn't shocked he'd committed fraud. He'd stolen from her too during their marriage, had forged her signature on credit applications, had hidden debts, and lied constantly. She'd divorced him when she'd discovered the extent of his deception, but the damage to her credit and finances had taken years to repair. She'd said she was glad he was finally facing consequences, that maybe 8 years in prison would teach him what multiple divorces and bankruptcies hadn't. I'd doubted it. Some people never learned. They just got better at hiding their crimes or finding new victims. The house on Maple Street that I'd grown up in, that 3 generations of my family had owned, that Donovan had briefly stolen through fraud, now belonged to a young family with 2 kids. I'd driven past it once after the sale, seen playground equipment in the backyard and bikes in the driveway. New life in a space that had held so much history and recent pain. It had been bittersweet, letting go of the physical place while keeping the memories. But those memories were mine regardless of who owned the property. Donovan couldn't steal those, couldn't forge documents claiming he'd experienced my childhood or shared my mother's love. Those were beyond his reach, protected by truth he'd never be able to manipulate. Sometimes I'd thought about confronting Donovan in prison, visiting him to ask why he'd done it, what he'd been thinking, if he'd felt any guilt about stealing from his own sister's estate. But I'd never gone. What would have been the point? He'd lie or rationalize or blame me for having what he'd wanted. The conversation would have changed nothing, would have given him attention he didn't deserve. The safe, the deed, and the recording hidden in my mother's closet had spoken louder than anything Donovan could say. They'd told the truth he'd tried to bury. They'd ensured justice happened despite his fraud. That was enough. The recording of Mom's voice, preserved on her phone and then on the audio file in the safe, had been the last time I'd heard her speak with such clarity and strength. Telling Donovan no, defending her right to leave her property to her son, recognizing his threats and documenting them. She'd been protecting me even then, months before she'd died, knowing that her brother might try exactly what he'd eventually attempted. Her foresight and courage had saved the inheritance she'd wanted me to have. The house Donovan thought he'd stolen so cleverly had been protected by evidence he'd never known existed. He'd underestimated her completely. That mistake, more than any investigative work or legal maneuvering, had been his downfall. 4 years after returning from overseas, I'd built a good life with the foundation my mother's inheritance had provided. The condo I'd bought, the career I'd established, the financial security she'd wanted me to have. None of it would have been possible if Donovan had succeeded in his theft. But he hadn't succeeded. The safe had destroyed his fraud as completely as his forged deed had temporarily enabled it. Sometimes justice required hidden truth, carefully preserved, waiting for the right moment to be revealed. My mother had created that truth. I'd found it, and Donovan was serving 8 years for underestimating both of us. Her wisdom and my persistence had been stronger than his greed and deception. The deed he'd forged was voided. The recording he'd never knew existed had convicted him, and the house he'd never truly owned was sold to a family who would fill it with legitimate memories. That was justice, imperfect but real, and it had mattered more than any amount of money. My mother's final gift hadn't been just the house. It had been the truth, hidden but protected, waiting to expose the fraud and restore what had been stolen. Donovan thought he'd won by forging documents and lying to courts. He'd lost the moment my mother decided to create evidence he couldn't destroy. She'd known him better than he'd known himself. That knowledge, preserved in a safe behind a false panel, had been his undoing. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.